Hi, folks, and welcome to the podcast. So, in today's session, which is just for members of the Type 2 program, I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different, actually. I'm going to talk about the connection between hyperglycemia, high blood sugar levels, and all of the illnesses that we fear the most, from heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, all of those, and the kind of possible mechanisms at play there that would explain why, if you're type 2 diabetic, you're at a much higher risk of those kind of illnesses. Welcome to the podcast. If you haven't subscribed already, please do just click the subscribe button over here and the little bell icon down the other side. So what that'll do, if you're subscribed and you click the bell notification, it will mean that 5 or 10 minutes before we go live every week, and it's the same time every week anyway, you get a little notification on YouTube in your app that will say Ready Care Control going live in 10 minutes. So you can just click on that and that will take you straight to the talk. Just in case you don't get the link or we're late sending the link out. Excuse me. Okay, so let's have a look at this, which is what I wanted to talk about. So first of all, these are all of the conditions that we know there's well-established mechanisms connecting insulin resistance. No, and all of these conditions. First of all, to explain insulin resistance is a way of describing what happens when your pancreas is under pressure from making a lot of insulin and then stops responding to insulin. Your body, your cells, your muscles, your tissues stop responding to insulin in the body. So Dr. Donald Collins, a good friend of mine and the doctor at Havant in the UK, explains this very well by saying that when you first go into a maternity ward and you hear babies screaming, you know, the nurses working on the maternity ward will it'll just wreck their heads. It'll really annoy them. It's really high pitched sounds and you're responding to them. But after a while, after a couple of weeks, you actually don't hear it anymore. And the same thing happens. Again, the white noise analogy is quite good as well. Where there's a radio doing that kind of sound, that will annoy the hell out of you for a couple of hours. And then you'll find it hard to get to sleep if you turn it off. So insulin resistance is kind of like that. Your pancreas breaks from being overloaded with carbohydrates and or glucose. And remember, carbohydrates and sugar are essentially the same thing. So when your pancreas is overloaded and is tired making insulin to try and control your blood sugar levels, it kind of breaks, but instead of making less insulin, it makes more. It's kind of like the accelerator braking in a car. So it goes into overdrive, making insulin, and your body stops responding to it. And then you have very high levels of insulin that your body is not managing appropriately, that's doing damage elsewhere. And what it does is that's essentially what's happening with type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance, and the beta islet cells in the pancreas burn out and your body can't make enough insulin. It's making too much insulin, ironically, that your body is not responding to anymore. So you need more insulin or more insulin-like medications like metformin, Victoza, and so on. That's diabetes. Obesity is driven by high insulin levels. Dyslipidemia, we've covered a few times, that is cholesterol. When your insulin levels are high, your HDL goes down, your good cholesterol, and triglycerides, the fats in your blood, go up predictably every single time. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is mediated by two mechanisms known as endothelin 1, which is insulin goes up, and endothelin 1 is a potent vasoconstrictor and just constricts the blood vessels. And then it also, insulin being high also blocks your arteries' ability to relax the way they should through restricting production of something called nitric oxide. Now, neurological cancer and heart disease are what I want to look at tonight. So I'm going to look at the connection between high blood sugar levels and Alzheimer's. We'll also look at, does red meat cause cancer? And is there a connection between high blood sugar levels and cancer? Because there's a really interesting model emerging in the clinical literature at the moment, which is proposing a link between, and by the way, this was done almost 100 years ago as well, a link between high blood sugar levels and many different types of cancer. This was first described or proposed, I should say, by a doctor back in 1938 known as Dr. Otto Warburg, who showed that cancer prefers glucose as a fuel source and finds it very difficult to proliferate on a low glucose diet or in a low glucose environment. So a low carb diet. And actually, he won the Nobel Prize. He wasn't some lunatic. He was a very well-established doctor. Okay, so often when we look at the foods that we should eat more of, the meats, the saturated fat-based foods, we think, well, surely that'll do something bad. From all the conditioning I've had over the last 30 or 40 years would tell us that saturated fat might be bad for us. That's been the rhetoric or the kind of talk of the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm ashamed to say that I would have said that. I remember somebody coming to me as a practitioner, and when I was working as a nutritionist, and somebody said to me, "I'm doing this. What's the name of the company? Oh, they're called Keto Gym. No, it'll come to me in a minute. But there was a company anyway who you'd go in and they do like 12 days of really intensive exercise. They put someone on what I now know to be a ketogenic diet, a very high fat, low carb diet. And I remember in my naivety when I knew less about metabolic health saying, God, I wouldn't like to see your arteries if you stayed on that in the long term, because that's what I was conditioned to believe without actually looking at the literature. That's what you hear lots of people talking about if they don't know the literature all that well. They'll say things like, God, those eggs might give you high cholesterol. Um, Red meat, does that increase your risk of cancer and heart disease? So that's the sort of thing I want to look at. Does eating red meat increase your risk of cancer? Does eating saturated fat increase your risk of heart disease? And give you just some evidence on that. Okay, we know the foods to, I won't batter this one anymore, but the foods to avoid: the bread, rice, pasta, breakfast cereals, starchy vegetables, high sugar fruits, which are particularly bad if you're diabetic because grapes and bananas contribute to what's known as intrahepatic um, triglyceride buildup. So basically, fattens your liver. That's it. So bananas and grapes will fatten your liver. They taste great though. That's the problem. Okay, so if we look at Alzheimer's and blood sugar control, it's really, really interesting because the literature is now, the mechanisms are so well established in the literature that we're now referring to, I say we collectively as in researchers, and now referring to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. And the reason we're calling it type 3 diabetes is because Alzheimer's is characterized by neurofibrillary tangles in the brain, so tangles in the kind of neurons that fire in the brain. And they are caused in no small part by insulin resistance, by high levels of insulin. So again, the high levels of insulin that you get if your blood sugars are very high goes on to lead to Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and even just at a much lower level, much less serious level, that kind of early cognitive decline and the brain fog that we talk about is often due to dysglycemia, or your blood sugar levels going up and down and up and down and up and down. That's what tends to cause that kind of brain fog. So it's when your blood sugar levels are going low, that's where you get the kind of fuzzy kind of brain, or the kind of brain fog. And interestingly enough, that's another mechanism by which being diabetic can lead to Alzheimer's, or not just being diabetic, but having poor blood sugar control. Because if your blood sugar control is not good and you're diabetic, but you're still eating cereals and potatoes and rice and pasta and that sort of stuff, blood sugars go up very high. And it's the highs that cause the lows. And the lows, which are referred to as hypoglycemia, they damage an area in the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is often referred to as the CEO of the brain, the one that makes all the kind of higher level decisions. So if you are suffering from brain fog, this is a really interesting one. I was just putting together some slides on how to improve your concentration and focus for our corporate clients. If you want to improve your concentration and focus, switch your brain and your body's fuel source, its main go-to fuel source, from glucose, which is a very unstable fuel source, only lasts 20 minutes to an hour and a half, 2 hours, and requires a top up every time your blood sugar levels go down. That, by the way, is the reason that if you eat a lot of carbohydrate, and if you have a bowl of pasta, for example, this used to happen to me all the time in work, and it only made sense to me when I went on a ketogenic diet and completely stopped. I'd be staring at the computer screen, and it was always around 3 o'clock, 3:15, half three, that I'd start to, 5 minutes would pass and I'd realize I was just staring at the screen, or had gone on to Facebook and wasn't even thinking about it. And I don't really like social media. I never look at it anymore, but I'd be just wasting, and I'd just zone out. I'd lose concentration and I'd zone out completely. And the main reason that happens is because glucose is a very unstable fuel source. So glucose does this: your blood sugar levels go up, and then your blood sugar levels come back down. And when they come, let me get that on camera. Blood sugar levels go up and then they go back down. And when they go back down, they tend to go lower than they were before you ate. So the highs cause the lows. Sometimes people would assume that their blood sugar levels are low, therefore they're not eating enough carbohydrate. But funnily enough, the main reason for your blood sugar levels going low is that they went high in the first place. It's an overcorrection by the pancreas. So if you want to get really, really solid concentration and focus, you want to derive most of your brain's energy from what are known as ketones. Now, ketones, the names for them are probably not important, but the main one is beta hydroxybutyrate. And basically, it is fat broken down to be used as a fuel source. and that's what ketones are. So you can actually take in ketones in your diet in the form of things like coconut oil and MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, or you can just eat a higher fat, lower carb diet, and that will teach your body to run on ketones as its primary fuel source. And ketones are pretty much unlimited because fat adaptation teaches the body to run on ketones for fuel and dramatically improves your concentration and focus. And we have fat on board. So even a super lean athlete who's got like 5-6% body fat has 3 or 4 days worth of body fat to run on if they weren't even eating. The other thing fasting does is it boosts your brain function. So the literature has shown a 400% increase in something known as BDNF, which stands for brain derived neurotrophic factor. And this is the most incredible study I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, probably ever, in relation to mental health. So this group of researchers, I know one of them actually, Dr. Georgia Eady, I think she was on it. Yeah, she's the last author named there. Dr. Georgia Eady. She's got some brilliant talks on mental health on YouTube. But she and her team of researchers wanted to see, could a ketogenic diet affect mental illness, serious mental illness? So they put 28 patients, 12 of which had bipolar, really, really serious condition, 6 of which had major depressive disorder, again, really serious, and 10 of which had one of the most serious illnesses, mental illnesses you can suffer from, schizophrenia. So they put them on a ketogenic diet for, I think, 12 or 16 weeks. Now, at the end of the trial, an absolutely insane result would be that you had 1 or 2 of them who got rid of their bipolar or schizophrenia completely. Look at the number where it says achieve clinical remission with the brain on the right hand side. 43% of patients achieved clinical remission. 64% of them were discharged on less or no medication. Symptoms improved in 100% of patients. Now, I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom or talking about how nefarious the pharmaceutical industry may or may not be, but if that was a drug, my God, that would be an absolute blockbuster. Can you imagine 43%? So that means that, all other things being equal, 4 of the 10 patients with schizophrenia were no longer diagnosed with schizophrenia at the end, or were no longer considered to be schizophrenic. 4 or 5 of the patients who had bipolar were no longer considered to be bipolar at the end of that 16 weeks. And a couple out of the major depressives no longer had depression. And all of the others improved. I mean, just absolutely unbelievable. But you might not hear about this in the mainstream media. Now, this one is really interesting. So I wanted to talk about cancer just a little bit. So this is a review by a really good researcher. 2 really good researchers that I know of anyway. The others, I'm sure, are superb as well. Dominic D'Agostino is a big player in the ketogenic kind of space, low carb space in terms of researchers, and Thomas N. Seyfried. And Thomas Seyfried has brought about this kind of idea that cancer may be a metabolic disease. So it's characterized by a lot of the same things we see in diabetes, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, obesity, and so on. And he's looking at the idea that it might just be a further extension of high blood sugar levels, basically. And this is not new. And the reason I say this is not new is because the Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Otto Warburg, way back in the late 30s, the 1930s, I believe it was 1937, 1938, showed at a cellular level under a microscope that cancer loves glucose, it loves sugar, and it finds it very difficult to proliferate using ketones. It finds it very, very hard. Some would speculate that cancer cannot grow in a ketogenic diet. He also showed the difference between an acidic environment and an alkaline environment, and showed that it's less likely for cancer to proliferate in an alkaline environment. Now, I want to be really clear on this. Keto diets have not been shown to cure cancer, but the mechanisms are there to suggest that it might be a much better way to eat to prevent cancer and potentially adapt as an adjunctive treatment to standard treatment. So whatever you do, don't listen to some lunatic over in here in Cork and say some health science guy was talking about the keto diet can cure cancer. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that research is ongoing. The mechanisms appear very clear. Cancer does look to be some sort of a metabolic, have a metabolic aspect to its pathophysiology. So, and again, Dr. Otto Warburg was talking about this, the metabolism of tumors, back in 1938, and won the Nobel Prize for it. So, if you do want to change your diet, and you do have cancer, just make sure you speak to your health professional. Don't take my advice, but this is just an interesting and kind of exciting field of study at the moment, but at a preliminary stage, to say the least. Okay, so this is one I wanted to kind of address as well. Is that you'll hear people saying, "Well, red meat and processed meat is surely that increases your risk of cancer." I've heard that somewhere. So first of all, this comes from kind of poorly structured and poor quality epidemiological research. Now, epidemiology is where you take, or epidemiological research is where you take a large population. You take, say, for example, 100,000 people over 30 years, and you give them a questionnaire once a year that says, how many times have you eaten red meat? How many times have you eaten chicken? How many times have you eaten fish? How many times have you eaten rice? I honestly can't remember what I ate yesterday. I mean, I'd literally have to sit down for 15 minutes and think about it. And I probably still wouldn't remember, let alone what I ate over the last year. So this is the problem with these studies. One, recall is awful for most people when it comes to longer periods of time and food. Really bad. It's very difficult to kind of get any good sense of what somebody eats. And two is that what they do with this research is they say the people who ate the most red meat, so they eat red meat every day, got the most cancer. But what you're doing is you're taking one factor out of hundreds of factors. So the other examples would be they might smoke, they may or may not drink, they may or may not take drugs, they may or may not have lots of other health conditions. The red meat they're eating, is it at McDonald's or is it a grass-fed steak? If it is at McDonald's, are they having a strawberry milkshake and fries and an apple pie with it? Because that could be what's causing the cancer, not the red meat. So epidemiological data shows correlation, not causation. It shows a connection between two things, but can never prove one thing caused another. So there's some really interesting examples of this correlation being a disaster and not proving causation on a website, if you're interested in looking it up, called spuriouscorrelations.com. Spurious correlations shows things like every time Nicolas Cage brings out a movie, there's a huge uptick in drownings in a particular area, say Minnesota. But the Nicolas Cage movies are obviously not causing the drownings. But if you look at it on a graph, it's exactly matched. It's exactly matched. There's another one that shows that people who do yoga are much more likely to die from I can't remember. There's a particular type of cancer, but there's no way that yoga is causing that cancer. Just no way at all. So again, these are spurious correlations. Red meat and cancer is a spurious correlation. Now, the biggest systematic review and meta-analysis of the cohort studies that all showed any connection between red meat and cancer came to the conclusion in 2019 that the possible absolute effects of red meat and even processed meat consumption on cancer mortality and incidence are very small. And the certainty of evidence is low to very low. So basically, they don't prove anything, nothing at all. And it shouldn't be a surprise, because how could an ancient ancestral food that we've evolved to eat for hundreds of thousands of years and millions in some shape or form be suddenly causing cancer, but only since the 70s? Doesn't make sense. Again, same thing with saturated fat and heart health. The conclusions found that there was doing the meta-analysis of those kind of epidemiological studies showed that there's no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated, with an increased risk of coronary heart disease or CVD. So if it did, then where is the Inuit heart disease and cancer epidemic? So if we look at these remote tribes around the world, like the Inuit, the Maasai tribe, the Hadza, a lot of these some eat loads of meat, some eat exclusively meat and no fruit and no processed food whatsoever. They eat meat and internal organs, yet they get almost no cancer compared to us in the Western world. Almost none. They get almost no heart disease. And funnily enough, they don't tend to have fatty liver, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, all of the things that we see over here that are associated with high blood sugar levels and high insulin levels. So, I mean, the evidence for a low carb and ketogenic diet being really good for you is just, I mean, it's overwhelming at this stage. It really is. It's hard not to look at the literature when you know what you're looking at and think, why in the name of God would anyone eat carbs? Except for one very obvious answer. They taste great. They're great fun and they taste great. I'm not going to sit here and go, I don't even like junk food. I would survive on takeaways and chocolate and ice cream and pizza. I love it. I absolutely love that sort of food. I just value my health more than I do pizza and ice cream tasting nice for 3 minutes. So while it's okay to have that stuff once a week or once every couple of weeks, you'll probably get away with that. I wouldn't go to carbohydrates as my go-to at all. And I think people need to move away from this kind of processed and refined carbs, and always talking about processed and refined carbs. All carbohydrates convert to sugar in the blood. Potatoes and bananas and grapes are not particularly processed, but they will cause a hell of a lot of damage if you are if you have a proclivity for having high blood sugar levels. So low carb definitely, and whole food for sure. So the solution is basically eat real food if you want to minimize your chances of fatty liver, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, all of those. There's one very clear thing you can do: eat single ingredient foods. Shop in the outskirts of the supermarket. Don't have bad stuff in the house. Just don't. It's a bad idea, because your current state of mind is not going to be the same state of mind on Wednesday night when you're stressed after a busy day at work and somebody rang you and said something that peed you off. It's just not. So don't have it in the house. I predictably wander downstairs every night at about 10:30, 11:15, and look through the presses, only to mutter something under my breath about my wife not allowing me to have bad stuff in the house. Because if it was there, I would eat it. And then the next day, I'm glad I didn't. So it's always a good approach to keep it out of the house. Guys, thanks so much for joining me. I'm just going to have a quick check to see if we have any comments. Beverly, good evening. Hope everyone is coping in this heat. Any tips on alternative to ice lollies? Not really, Beverly. It's hard to get any ice lollies that are kind of low carb or low sugar. It's practically unheard of, because they'll do the whole low fat, fat-free thing, and sure, then they'd be full of sugar. But you could make them yourself. So we did this for the kids. Not this exact way, but this is what we do for the kids. We get the ice pops you can make yourself. We fill them with cold fizzy water, and then about a quarter of them with, the little molds you can get, and about a quarter of them with my waddy sweetened with stevia. It's a particular type of fruit cordial you can get. So I think it's the berry, pear, and apple one or something like that. But they love it. I like them as well, actually. They're really nice, funnily enough. Now, they're not the same as your shop bought ice pops. Like, it's not going to taste like a Magnum, but they do the job. Hey, Charlie. Charlie saying, hi, Andy. I really miss bread. Any help would be appreciated. Thanks. No bother. So I will send you the link that one of my UK patients sent me for a bread or a bread mix. She did say it's really expensive. I don't know what that means. I think it might be like 10 or 12 pounds for a loaf, something ridiculous. But it is low carb and apparently tastes amazing. So I'll email you the link for that straight away. Guys, go out and enjoy the rest of the evening. Be careful in the sun. Thanks for joining me. I will be back next Thursday, as always. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. And again, click that bell notification. Have a good evening. Enjoy the sun. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.